Marxism, Cosmopolitanism, and, quote, the, end quote, Jews, by Philip Spencer. I'm going to read the abstract here. Marxists have had a complex and contentious relationship to the question of both cosmopolitanism and anti-Semitism. The difficulties and problems they have encountered with each may, however, be related. They can be traced back to a repeated failure to take seriously Marx's initial critique of contemporary anti-Semites and his simultaneous adoption of a cosmopolitan approach to politics, which set him apart from many of his peers. Rather than confronting anti-Semitism, many Marxists adopted the view that it contained some kind of rational kernel, whilst drifting towards an accommodation with forms of nationalism. Having ignored and largely failed to respond to the mortal threat that a radicalized anti-Semitism posed for Jews, the self-proclaimed Marxists ruling the Soviet Union then accused Jews of being both nationalists of the wrong Zionist sort and cosmopolitans, now a term of abuse. There is, however, an alternative tradition that may be recovered, albeit on the margins of the Marxist movement, in the later work especially of Horkheimer and Adorno, and in some parallel way also of Hannah Arendt, that sees anti-Semitism from a cosmopolitan perspective as an inherently reactionary that sees anti-Semitism from a cosmopolitan perspective as an inherently reactionary political force which, as it became genocidal, came to threaten both Jews and humanity at large. That's end of the abstract. Philip Spencer wrote a book with Ben Fine, who at least at some point was a member of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty in the UK. The book was titled, and I don't know Spencer's affiliation politically. I know he's a leftist, but and writes frequently on Marx. That book was called Anti-Semitism and the Left. It's a very good book. Kind of probably I'll talk about a lot. I recommend reading it if you're interested. I'm not going to read it here because I've already read it, and the way I organize these things is just like whatever I happen to be reading anyway, I make into an audiobook because maybe someone somewhere will listen to it, and it takes no more time to read something than to make an audiobook of it, so might as well do that. Anyway, introduction. Marxists have long had a complex and contentious relationship to the question of both cosmopolitanism and anti-Semitism. The difficulties and problems they have encountered with each, and indeed created on occasion, may, however, be related. With respect to cosmopolitanism, there has been over time a widespread, though not universal, failure to transcend the limitations of what at perhaps the deepest level, following Erlich Brecht, and more critically, Daniel Czernilo, we might now see as a kind of methodological nationalism in which the nation-state is taken as the primary frame of reference. Many Marxists, though not all, came to a growing accommodation to at least certain kinds of nationalism and have ended up even explicitly rejecting cosmopolitanism itself as a set of overarching values and commitments. With respect to anti-Semitism, there has been a widespread failure to take sufficiently seriously its increasingly destructive and reactionary character in the modern world. The threat posed to Jews by the Nazis in particular was not recognized by most Marxists as it was emerging. As that threat was realized in the Holocaust, there was only a weak and limited response from the organized Marxist movement. After the event, an ominous inversion took place in what was seen by many to be the center of that movement, which has ironically appeared to give a further and perverse twist to the history of anti-Semitism. These are more than parallel developments. They have common roots which may be traced back to a widespread, though again not universal, failure to sustain and develop what was distinctive about Marx's original endeavors in the 1840s. His profound insights at a formative historical moment into the need for a politics that challenged the dominant ways in which the so-called national question was coming to be framed, which included what is reactionary about about nationalism as an ideology, and the need, on the other, to think much more deeply about the so-called Jewish question, a framing of the issue which similarly occluded what is reactionary about anti-Semitism. This hiatus was to have extremely grave consequences for Jews and for humanity as a whole, to the degree to which Jews had become the cosmopolitan subject par excellence. Spread out across nation-states, they were to become the most, though not the only, vulnerable group as nationalism developed in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Identified everywhere, to a greater or lesser extent, by nationalists as a problem for the imagination, Jews ended up losing what had only recently been granted at best, their rights as citizens. Their right to have rights, and in the Holocaust, their human status, which was the distinctive focus of Marx's original arguments. From a cosmopolitan perspective, the failure by Marxists to develop a coherent and sustained response to a radicalized anti-Semitism was particularly significant. The Marxist movement was, for over a century, potentially the main organized vehicle for a radical cosmopolitan politics, in a world order comprised of competing nation-states, each pursuing their own interests within the framework established at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which prescribes states from intervening in the internal affairs of other states. In this context, the international solidarity which underpinned the creation of first the Second and then the Third Internationals, both largely dominated by Marxist ideas and movements, could have provided one of the few mechanisms for organizing solidarity with the victims of the violence of modern states, not only across borders, in the case of wars between states, but within them, when in the case of genocide they targeted minority groups for destruction. A fundamental principle underpinning the creation of each of these organizations in the first place was a cosmopolitan one, a solidarity between members of an international working class. In its Marxist formulation, the proletariat was conceived of as a universal class swelling in size to the point at which it would encompass all of humanity. Its cosmopolitanism was of what James Ingram has recently defined as a bottom-up and non-statist kind, even if this was modified to some extent when the Soviet Union came into existence. At the most basic level, which, as David Held argues, is where cosmopolitan solidarity begins, what the principle implied was that the internationals would come to the aid of those most urgent in need and prioritize rescue and refuge to those most acutely at risk, those who lacked any nation-state of their own to which they could flee, Jews certainly and arguably the Roma and Sinti, although the Nazis perhaps exhibited slightly less destructive certainty in the latter case. Even those who could flee to other states were not guaranteed protection where they were granted, at best, a reluctant temporary refuge. Even here, as Derrida has recently reminded us, recalling Hannah Arendt's experience and observation, Jews were again acutely vulnerable to policing agencies which treated them at best with suspicion and at worst collaborated eagerly with the Nazis in their renewed persecution. In such circumstances, only an organized non-state and radical cosmopolitan movement could have offered the unqualified aid that was so desperately needed. That aid would have had to be grounded in a more extensive notion of a right to hospitality than that advanced even by the most liberal cosmopolitans. As a radical form of cosmopolitanism, it would have to go beyond, in particular, as Derrida has argued, Kant's explicit restriction to the fundamentally temporary right of visitation. In this case, because those threatened by the Nazis could not go back to what could never again be, quote, home, end quote. But Derrida's own reference point, the global city as the most relevant and viable site of cosmopolitan solidarity today, is in a way indicative itself of the legacy of the International's failure, to the extent that the Marxist movement was never confined to cities alone. None of this is to say that a different response would have been successful in saving anything like a majority of Jews from their fate. Clearly, many other factors far beyond the reach and responsibility of the Marxist movement have to be taken into account in thinking about who could have come to the aid of Jews. But what is striking is how little reflection there has been on this issue from this perspective. Only a few thinkers working at best on the margins of the Marxist movement, notably Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, and to some extent Hannah Arendt, have devoted significant effort in the light of the catastrophe that had occurred to retrieving some element of the cosmopolitan way of responding to the anti-Semitism tradition that Marx himself inaugurated. However marginal and limited these efforts may nevertheless, as I suggest in the concluding section of this chapter, point to some continuing relevance for this tradition, as anti-Semitism continues to mutate and to threaten both Jews and humanity in the modern world. Marx's early critique of nationalism. Marx's cosmopolitan critique of nationalism has, of course, to be placed, like his response to anti-Semitism, in its historical context. The 1840s might be characterized as both the high point and the turning point of liberal nationalism. In the decades that had followed the French Revolution, most progressive thinkers and movements believed, as the early French revolutionaries had done, that democracy and nationalism went hand in hand, that Sieyès had famously put it in 1789, the term, quote, people and, quote, nation were, quote, synonymous. Let me make sure I'm saying this person's name right.
Sieyès.
Sieyès. Okay. As far as the Jews were concerned, they had been included in the nation by French revolutionaries, but only as individuals and only on certain conditions. As Clermont-Tonnerre famously put it in his speech advocating their emancipation, quote, the Jews could be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals, end quote. Words which are ambiguous in both meaning and effect. From one liberal perspective, they could be interpreted to mean that Jews were required to abandon their traditional status as a, quote, nation within the nation, end quote. Alternatively, and more radically, however, they could mean that Jews should henceforth abandon any sense of collective identity at all and be subsumed within a homogenized nation. This ambiguity was not accidental or purely contingent on that political context. Liberalism has not provided an unambiguously secure basis for confronting anti-Semitism for a variety of reasons which are largely beyond the scope of this paper, but which involve at the political level the manifold connections which developed throughout the 19th and 20th centuries between liberalism and nationalism. And at the social level, insofar as this can be considered separately from the political, repeatedly expressed concerns about how even a liberal nation can be held together without a shared national culture. All too often not seen to include those who continued to think of themselves in some way or other as Jews. At the dawn of modern liberalism in the Enlightenment, there was already a dominant view shared by many, though not all, thinkers that there was something inherently problematic about the maintenance in the modern world of a specifically Jewish identity. Just as many Enlightenment thinkers made all organized religion the object of criticism, but treated Judaism with disproportionately more scorn and contempt, there lurked, beneath the newfound revolutionary toleration for Jews, an assumption on the part of both moderates and radicals that Jews would in return give up being Jewish altogether because this particular identity was especially archaic and worthless. As Pierre Birnbaum has shown in the case of the renowned emancipationist Abbé Grégoire,
Abbé Grégoire.
God, I'm good. Abbe Gregoire, I'm a fucking genius. Such assumptions were normally shared even by the most articulate and consistent advocates of Jewish emancipation in the new republic. Marx criticized both assumptions that the people and the nation were the same thing. Excuse me. I'm going to reread that sentence. As Pierre Birnbaum has shown in the case of the renowned emancipationist Abbé Gregoire, such assumptions were normally shared even by the most articulate and consistent advocates of Jewish emancipation in the new republic. Marx criticized both assumptions that the people and the nation were the same thing, that the Jews should be the object of particular suspicion, and he did so in the same period and on the same cosmopolitan lines that have not been followed, though they could be, by most subsequent Marxists. As Gilbert Achinger has recently argued, a cosmopolitan thread runs throughout Marx and Engels' work, and it was particularly striking at the time he was developing his critique of Bruno Bauer, who came in for particular criticism specifically for his German chauvinism in the German ideology. Achinger argues that Marxist cosmopolitanism was distinct from prevailing conceptions which were variously philosophical, institutional, juridical, or economic. It formed a core part of his historical materialist approach to history and politics, which here as elsewhere involved a critique rather than dismissal of hitherto partial and one-sided conceptions. I wonder if Spencer would be citing Gilbert Achinger today, because Gilbert Achinger has written some of the most inflammatory of all left-wing thinkers. Celebration of the October 7th Hamas pogrom as a dazzling act of, it's something seriously like a dazzling act of resistance to Israel. I wonder if Spencer would continue to cite Achinger so positively. Anyway, just a side note. A cosmopolitan perspective lay at the heart, in particular, of his conception of the proletariat, we're speaking about Marx now, of Marx's conception of the proletariat as a universal class, as the, quote, bearer, end quote, as Achinger puts it, of, quote, a global communist future, end quote. One which could not be fought for within the narrow and distorted confines of a nationalist frame of reference. On the one hand, Marx and Engels argued that, quote, working people have no country, the nationality of the worker is neither French nor English nor German, it is labor, free slavery, self-huckstering. His government is neither French nor English nor German nor English, it is capital. Does it say English twice in the original? Drop a comment if you know the answer to that. At the same time, they claim that, quote, the greatest mass of the proletarians are, by their nature, free from national prejudice, and their whole disposition and movement is essentially humanitarian and anti-nationalist, end quote. This may have been an overly optimistic assessment of the state of working-class consciousness at the moment in time, but it formed only one part of a sophisticated and discriminating critique of nationalism as a form of politics, grounded, as Erica Benner has argued, quote, in a normative conception of the human community, end quote. This normative conception was fundamentally cosmopolitan, concerned not with what divided the international working class, but what was shared both materially and culturally. Above all, Marx's primary concern was to encourage solidarity across national boundaries, a solidarity which he believed was imperiled by the appeal of rival nationalisms. This danger became particularly clear in the 1848 revolutions. Rather than uniting in a common struggle against the forces of reaction, German nationalists opted, as Langesvia has noted, quote, to cooperate with counter-revolution, to advance their interest against other nations, end quote. Rejecting out of hand the right of national self-determination, which they claimed for themselves, being applied to Danes, Poles, Italians, or Czechs. Opposition to such divisive nationalism in 1848 came only from the internationalist part of the left, which was led by Marx himself. Within the organized Marxist movement, this critical stance was largely abandoned as various attempts were made to distinguish between different kinds of nationalism, some supposedly progressive, others reactionary. The most politically significant of these efforts was made by Lenin, who argued that there was a critical difference between the nationalism of the oppressor and the nationalism of the oppressed. Lenin's argument was largely instrumental in the first instance, put forward in the hope that Marxists might somehow be able to utilize nationalist resistance to Tsarist imperial rule. The task of developing what was initially a purely instrumental tactic into a more general position was perhaps not insignificantly entrusted to Joseph Stalin, the least theoretically equipped of all the Marxist revolutionaries who contrived a set of rigid criteria, or, quote, mathematical formulae, end quote, as Enzo Traverso puts it, one of whose signal consequences was to repeat the old refrain that Jews in particular could not form a nation. Not all Marxists, however, were prepared to abandon Marx's cosmopolitan standpoint, most notably Rosa Luxemburg, whose opposition to nationalism has often been far too casually dismissed as abstract and unrealistic. For her, like Marx, nationalism was essentially a category of bourgeois ideology. It was reactionary economically and politically. It divided workers across national boundaries by invoking the primacy of reified national identities over all other identities, where nationalists were successful in shaping the terms of national self-determination. It would only lead to new states of oppressing the minorities in their midst. Although anti-Semitism was not Luxemburg's own primary focus, this, as Anita Shelton has argued, was bound to have especially serious consequences for Jews, since they were a minority everywhere. 1 second. Still here, kids. 1 second. Okay. The potential violence of nationalist ideology was realized in Luxemburg's lifetime on an extreme and unprecedented scale in the First World War, against which she called, albeit in vain, for the cosmopolitan solidarity of an international working-class movement. Only this, she believed, could save humanity from what she presciently defined as the threat of a general, quote, reversion to barbarism, end quote. Luxemburg's reference to barbarism was not purely rhetorical, but drew explicitly on a suggestion, which made earlier by Engels, that at some point the direction of history itself, quote, world history, end quote, is the term she used, might be at stake. If the proletariat did not rise to the challenge as an international class, a global war could bring about catastrophe for humanity itself. If we extend Luxemburg's intuition to encompass both world wars, it could be argued that her cosmopolitan approach enabled her to have greater insight than many other Marxists at the time into the more profound consequences of the triumph of nationalism as the empires which had dominated Europe for so long fragmented. Where other Marxists followed Lenin into an uncritical support for the right of nations to self-determination, Luxemburg argued that this could all too easily be used to justify the claims of post-imperial nationalist elites who successfully achieved state power to oppress minorities within their own borders, who were deemed to belong to other, quote, nations, end quote, or in the case of Jews, to no nation at all. Anti-Semitism and the, quote, Jewish question, end quote. Luxemburg was also rare, however, among Marxists of her generation in taking seriously Marx's understanding of the Jewish question, and in particular his critique of what we can now see as the proto-anti-Semitism of Bruno Bauer. Marx's response to Bauer appeared in the form of two seminal essays, On the Jewish Question, published in 1843, in which he developed crucial elements of his own conception of human emancipation more generally. These essays, which were Marx's only sustained and focused writings on the issue, have been the subject of sustained debate for many years between those who find in them and in some of his later, more occasional remarks damning evidence of anti-Semitism and those who seek to exculpate Marx from any such charge. Pierre Birnbaum has provided a substantial review of this debate, summarizing the arguments on both sides. It may well be, as Birnbaum himself concludes, that Marx's essays and many of his subsequent comments are riddled with anti-Semitic expressions and tropes. And I'm going to, as a side note, Michael Heinrich says this is absolutely true, that many of Marx's subsequent comments are riddled with anti-Semitic expressions and tropes. It's not something that just critics of Marx say. But probably one of the top Marx scholars in the world that's alive today says, yeah, there's anti-Semitic shit in Marx. And that is even though he is from a Jewish background, or from, like, in, you know, how much that is. I mean, he wasn't raised particularly theistic. His father converted to Protestantism, Lutheranism, I believe. That would make sense in Germany, on the grounds that because Jews were barred access to, I guess what would be the bar exam or whatever, to become a lawyer in Germany, which Marx's father was, he had to convert to Protestantism. So his background isn't all that Jewish, but even in terms of like culture or whatever, but there is that like. Doesn't mean that there's not anti-Semitic content within his writings. You know, as someone who's pro-Marx, like myself, we should be open and clear about that, and critique that. Not try to say, oh, you know, it's all blown out of proportion or something like that. And I think Michael Heinrich gives us a good model of that. Because he certainly critiques it. Anyway, sorry. Where am I? Okay. Back to the text. There would have been nothing new or distinctive about any of this. What was new about Marx's critique of Bauer was that he challenged directly and from a cosmopolitan perspective the assumption of the majority of even the most progressive Enlightenment thinkers that there was something uniquely problematic about Jews. When Bauer had argued, in what was by now a familiar vein, that Jews should only be given citizenship rights if they gave up being Jews, Marx strongly disagreed, insisting that it was fundamentally wrong to make such a demand, to single out Jews and Judaism, and that Jews were as entitled to full rights in the political state as anyone else. The problem was not Jews or Judaism, but the political state and a notion of human emancipation that was confined only to the political sphere. As Robert Fine has argued, this was a radical move on Marx's part. It broke with what he has called the, quote, whole perspective of the Jewish question, end quote, one that saw the continued existence of Jews as a problem for an otherwise purportedly civil society or in this context, purportedly unified nation. It could only be a, quote, Jewish question, end quote, if the Jews were seen as the problem in the first place. Marx transformed the terms of this, quote, question, end quote. If Jews did not have rights, then the problem was the society from which they were excluded. This is a cosmopolitan perspective because it assumes that all human beings have rights, by virtue of their common and equal human status, and that if there is a society which excludes them, there is a problem with that society, not with those who are denied rights. This is not, of course, to say that Marx's own conception of rights is adequate, as he famously observed that, quote, not one of the so-called rights of man go beyond egoistic man, end quote. But his argument does not imply that such rights are irrelevant, but rather that they need to be further developed, and extended universally and unconditionally in this context to Jews. As Lars Fischer has shown, Luxemburg was a signal exception in grounding her approach to anti-Semitism in Marx's critique of Bauer. Most Marxists in the German Social Democratic Party, the largest and leading Marxist organization in the Second International, were far more prone to adopt Bauer's construction of a, quote, Jewish question, end quote, either out of ignorance or misunderstanding, willful or otherwise. The general tendency was to be critical for Jews for not being willing to relinquish their collective identity in the struggle for general emancipation, and to treat, quote, philo-Semitism, end quote, as a bigger problem than anti-Semitism inasmuch as it denied a supposed Jewish harmfulness. As anti-Semitism became an increasingly significant political movement, albeit with ebbs and flows and mixed fortunes, one of the leaders of the SPD, August Bebel, called it, quote, the socialism of fools, end quote. Bebel's adoption of this formulation was obviously critical, but it could be taken to mean that anti-Semitism had some kind of rational kernel, that the hostility anti-Semites felt towards Jews was understandable but misdirected, and that anti-Semitism contained some kind of progressive energy that needed to be harnessed. To put it another way, even if it were the socialism of fools, it could be seen as some kind of socialism. Marxism, of course, was not a monolith, and glimpses of a more cosmopolitan approach can be found at the same time, in the writings not only of Luxemburg, but also of Trotsky, both of whom offered a more serious understanding of the destructive character of modern anti-Semitism. In the heat of the 1905 revolution, for example, Trotsky argued that far from anti-Semites being won over to the socialist cause, as the, quote, rational kernel, end quote, approach would suggest, they played a pivotal role in the mobilization of counter-revolutionary forces. A critical aspect of Marx's critique of Bauer, which unorthodox Marxists struggled to recover and develop, was his recognition that anti-Semitism had much less to do with what Jews were doing or not doing than with how the, quote, Jews, end quote, were imagined. Modern anti-Semites had come to see the world through a lens crafted by the, quote, Jewish question, end quote. In a world of nation-states, they constructed, quote, the Jews, end quote, as an imaginary collectivity that was a problem for, and explained the problems of, what following Benedict Anderson's pioneering work, we now understand as an also imagined nation. The problem for Marxists was, on the one hand, that in regressing to Bauer's perspective, they came to assume that there was a Jewish question for such a society which needed solving. And, on the other hand, in abandoning cosmopolitan presuppositions, they were left with no secure basis on which to respond to a form of anti-Semitism which went beyond, even if it started within, a national frame of reference. At a critical moment, these parallel developments within Marxism would make it increasingly difficult to mount an effective challenge to the idea that the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, was one for each national society and for each nation-state to solve. Failing to respond to Nazi anti-Semitism. These twin developments set severe limits in particular on how the organized Marxist movement was to respond to the radicalization of anti-Semitism by the Nazis. For what is striking is how reluctant Marxists, whether they were social democrats or communists, were to confront anti-Semitism as such, to make it any kind of priority. This was true both before the Nazis came to power and in the underground and resistance when they had done so. Inside Germany, the Social Democrats, as Donald Neuweik has shown, Donald Neuweik, I think that's how you pronounce it. Unless he's American, there's some probably alternative pronunciation. For what is striking is how reluctant, Inside Germany, the Social Democrats, as Donald Neuweik has shown, did not appear to think that Nazi anti-Semitism was either deeply held or serious, and decided that it did not call for specific rebuttal, rarely taking direct action on this issue. After the seizure of power, the underground was instructed not to prioritize the issue on the grounds that it would make the work of the wider resistance more difficult. Recognition, at least implicitly, that anti-Semitism was more popular than they originally imagined. Klaus Mann, son of the great novelist Thomas Mann, and one of the most vigorous left-wing opponents of the Nazis, though not himself a member of the Social Democratic Party, spoke for many on the non-communist left when he argued as late as 1941 that, quote, anti-Semitism has already played too predominant a part in our propaganda. It is a dangerous mistake to overemphasize this one particular angle, end quote. No specific propaganda was ever produced to challenge Nazi arguments, and as Bankier argues, or Bankier, Bankier, argues, the party's attitude appears to have been a compound of distrust, resentment, and fear that it would be over-identified with the Jews. If the Social Democrats had nevertheless made some effort to cultivate good relations with the Jewish community, the Communists had a rather more problematic record. In the various twists and turns of communist politics, there were repeated episodes in which the party itself flirted with anti-Semitic discourse. In 1923, for example, the acknowledged leader of the left in the party at the time, Lars Fischer, made an infamous speech on July 1923 to students urging them to, quote, crush the Jewish capitalists and hang them from the lampposts, end quote, although she then went on to urge them to hang other capitalists too. In the early 1930s, the party, in another effort to appeal directly to Nazi followers and supporters, produced leaflets depicting Hitler, of all people, in league with Jewish capitalists. As with the Social Democrats and the underground, no efforts were made to confront anti-Semitism. It was not until Kristallnacht that the People's Party, Die Rote Fahne, finally gave the issue any prominence. But by the time of that state-sponsored violence, Jews had already been systematically removed from the German economy, polity, and society. German Marxists were, of course, not alone in failing to respond to the growing threat of Nazi anti-Semitism. The cosmopolitan resources in the writings of Marx and on the margins of the Marxist movement were not drawn upon almost anywhere on the organized left when they were most needed, as the Nazi assault moved beyond the borders of the German nation-state to encompass Jews across Europe and beyond. The problem now facing Jews, however, had to be confronted from a cosmopolitan perspective, because the threat they faced from Nazi anti-Semitism was to their human status, to their membership of humanity itself. Nazi anti-Semitism had what Saul Friedlander has called a, quote, redemptive, end quote, character. It articulated from the outset a picture of the, quote, Jews, end quote, as less than fully human and as a profound danger not just to Germany, but to every nation, to Europe, to the Aryan race, and to humanity itself. Only through the elimination of the, quote, Jews, end quote, could Germany or any nation or Europe or the Aryan race or even humanity itself be redeemed, be made whole and strong again. Nazi anti-Semitism was fundamentally a global project. It was nurtured inside one nation-state, drawing on existing traditions that held that Jews were not and could never be fully German, and developing new mechanisms which re-bonded a nation from which Jews were now systematically excluded, not least through exemplary acts of violence. That project was then broadened in the process, mobilizing significant other nationalist forces, especially in Eastern Europe, in support of a genocidal project, which aimed to eliminate, quote, the Jews, end quote, from the world and exorcise them not just from every nation, but from humanity itself. All too often, resistance to this assault was circumscribed within a national frame of reference which could not make what was happening to Jews such a priority. In France, for example, where significant numbers of Jews had migrated before the war, fleeing anti-Semitism not just in Germany, but from nationalist elites and movements further east, a distinction was first made between French and, quote, other, end quote, foreign, end quote, Jews to whom the French nation had no fundamental commitment. When the French state itself began its enthusiastic collaboration with the Nazis and began attacking French Jews too, much of the damage had been done because no priority had been given on the left to solidarity with Jews and opposition to anti-Semitism as such. Even when French Jews were being deported to the camps, communists and the resistance refused to make anti-Semitism a major issue. No propaganda was produced which highlighted what was being done to the Jews in France or indeed elsewhere. The communist section of the underground press, although of course it was not unique in this, effectively organized what Blattman and Poznansky have called a, quote, total silence, even when an anti-Semitic propaganda campaign was launched, and even when it directly targeted the resistance. Throughout the occupation, the resistance spared no effort to prove that its members had not signed up to the goal of defending the Jews, end quote. None of this is to ignore the heroism of individual rescuers of individual Jews or the courageous actions of small groups, like the Baum group in Germany. What Karen Monroe has called the, quote, hand of compassion, end quote, was offered by many remarkable individuals in some communities to Jews in extremely demanding conditions. But it is difficult to discern any common political factor in what we know of such cases, which do not appear to have been confined in any significant way to individuals on the left. If there is a politics which was shared, it may well have been at least implicitly cosmopolitan, and on occasion explicitly so, inasmuch as it involved a solidarity with the Jews, precisely because they were seen first and foremost as fellow human beings. But such a cosmopolitanism did not inform the strategic response of the organized Marxist movement anywhere at this time. I gotta pee. The Soviet response, from downplaying anti-Semitism to the simultaneous charge of, quote, Zionism and, quote, cosmopolitanism. The strategic response of most Marxists, organized as they largely were in communist parties, was not, of course, devised locally. It was designed and directed from the Soviet Union, a state whose interests and commitments, by definition, were supposed to transcend those of the nation-state. Here, the refusal to take anti-Semitism seriously was to have particularly disastrous consequences in the short term and alarmingly pervasive ones in the long term. As long as the Nazi-Soviet alliance held firm, the official policy of the state was to ignore what was being done to the Jews inside German-controlled territory. The border was sealed, although not that effectively, as some Jews did manage to flee east. When the attack on the Soviet Union began in 1941, after 2 years in which the Jews of German-occupied Poland had been subjected to extreme violence, as Ben Sion Pinchuk has shown, quote, there was no plan that took into account the special dangers facing the Jewish population. Reporting of what was happening to the Jews now inside Soviet territory was sporadic and inconsistent at best, and there were repeated efforts to diminish the scale and intensity of the violence. The first report, for example, that 52,000 Jews had been murdered at Babi Yar was amended down to a figure of 1,000. How much of this was due to rising or resurgent anti-Semitism inside the Soviet Union in the 1930s has been much debated, but what is clear is that there was no desire to prioritize what the Nazis were doing to the Jews. It was not for another year, a year and a half, that is, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, whose orders explicitly called for the mass killing of Jews, that the Soviet Union allowed itself to be associated with the statement published jointly by all the Allied governments and governments in exile on the, quote, extermination of the Jewish population by Europe, the extermination of the Jewish population of Europe by Nazi officials, end quote. As even Altman and Ingerflow, who generally downplay Stalinist anti-Semitism in this context, have noted, quote, neither from the Soviet state nor from the party was there a single appeal to underground organizations or the local population to help Soviet Jews, end quote. The regime repeatedly insisted that the war had little or nothing to do with the Jews. In 1943, a military council leader, for example, confidently quoted Stalin as saying that, quote, some comrades of Jewish descent believe that this war is being fought to save the Jewish nation. These Jews are mistaken. We fight the great patriotic war for the salvation, the freedom, and the independence of our homeland led by the great Russian people, end quote. A year later, as the Red Army in its sweep west was discovering what remained of the extermination camps, the Soviet Extraordinary State Commission to investigate German fascist crimes was explicitly instructed to avoid stating that the victims of the massacres had been Jews. It was true that a Jewish anti-fascist committee had been set up by the Soviet regime in 1942 alongside 4 other anti-fascist committees, with the objective of mobilizing support in the West for the Soviet war effort. As its name implies, however, it was not primarily about fighting anti-Semitism, but fascism, which is not the same thing, a confusion which has wrought some considerable havoc on efforts on the left to think about and to respond to anti-Semitism. The Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee did nevertheless do what it could to publicize what the Nazis were doing, with many of its members, even long-standing party members, seizing the opportunity to speak out directly about what the Nazis were doing to the Jews and often invoking in the process not only their own suppressed identity as Jews, but a longer history and sometimes personal experience of anti-Semitism. One of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee's major projects, developed in partnership with the writer Ilya Ehrenberg, another who now felt he had to assert his hitherto suppressed Jewish identity, was a detailed record of Nazi violence published in early 1946 as the Black Book, the Nazi crime against the Jewish people. But the regime had been vigilant from the outset, spying with its usual paranoid suspicion on the members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, even though it had vetted and appointed them itself, and recording all actual or potential deviations from party orthodoxy on the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, for future use. Drafts of the Black Book had already aroused serious concerns precisely for its emphasis on what had been done to Jews, and was hastily withdrawn in late 1947 from publication on the grounds that it contained, quote, grave political errors, end quote. All copies were destroyed along with the typeset. With the defeat of the Nazis, the committee had outlived its tactical utility, and noticeably long before the other anti-fascist committees were closed down, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was targeted. The first victim was its leading activist and spokesman, playwright Solomon Mikoels, Mikhoels. I should know how to pronounce that name. I took a Soviet history class and we talked about this guy, so I should know how to say his name, but I forgot. who was mysteriously murdered on Stalin's personal orders, in fact, in January 1948. The committee was wound up, and its leaders, some of them die-hard Stalinists, were arrested, tortured, and charged, and almost all shot. The two decisive terms of the charges laid against them appear at first sight as bizarrely contradictory. The leaders of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, and then many others too, were charged with Jewish nationalism and Zionism on the one hand, and cosmopolitanism on the other. The apparent contradiction between the two charges was much less important, however, than what connected them: connotations of disloyalty, lack of patriotism, foreignness, and not least, worldwide Jewish conspiracy. But charges flowed from accommodation to, in this instance, Russian nationalism, and both signified a further abandonment of Marx's cosmopolitan ways of thinking. The charge of Jewish nationalism rested for its part on a selective nationalism which again claimed to distinguish between progressive and reactionary forms. Since the Jews could not constitute a nation according to Stalin's arbitrary criteria, then no progressive Jewish nationalism could exist. To think or speak otherwise was to threaten the cohesion and unity of the nations among whom Jews were dispersed, and into which they were supposed to assimilate and disappear. The charge of Zionism demonstrated the supposed disloyalty of the Jews, not only clinging on to an identity they should have long forsworn when they were permitted to become members of the nation, but also implying a solidarity with other Jews which cut across the borders of the nation state and superseded the primacy of the loyalty which nationalists demanded. The charge of cosmopolitanism, for its part, was also premised on the primacy of national loyalty. The phrase, quote, rootless cosmopolitan Jew, end quote, was first cousin, as it were, to cognate terms like, quote, enemy of the people, end quote, or indeed, quote, enemy of the human species, end quote, which had emerged as tensions between democratic and nationalist logics began to come to the fore during the French Revolution. During the Terror, the Jacobins had commonly laid the charge, hostis generis humani, against those they accused not only of counter-revolution, but also betraying the French nation, whose interests were increasingly allied with those of humanity as a whole. A similar elision now occurred in the Soviet Union, where the particular, primarily Russian national interests of the state were said to correspond with the interests of the world proletariat, and the interests of the world proletariat in turn to correspond with the interests of humanity in general. Marx's sharp critique of the chauvinism lying behind Bauer's apparent universalism was now buried, and indeed the very terms he used were inverted. As one loyal Stalinist put it, quote, cosmopolitanism is an ideology alien to the workers. Communism has nothing in common with cosmopolitanism, end quote. Another described cosmopolitanism as a, quote, false, senseless, strange, and incomprehensible phenomenon, end quote. The cosmopolitan, quote, is a corrupt, unfeeling creature totally unworthy of being called by the holy name of man, end quote. Rethinking the question of anti-Semitism. These charges, of course, went beyond a further failure to think about anti-Semitism. They formed the basis of what was itself a distinctive contribution to the post-Holocaust repertoire of anti-Semitism, by no means confined to the Soviet Union, in which a new set of contradictory charges against Jews replaced the Nazi accusation that Jews were somehow responsible for both capitalism and communism. The question that arises here, however, is whether development like this was inevitable, or if there was another potential path for Marx that could have been or needs to be developed. Those who think that Marx was himself an anti-Semite would, of course, have no hesitation in answering in the affirmative to the first hypothesis. Even many of those who are not convinced by this charge would argue that there is nothing in Marxism that provides the basis for an adequate response to the question of anti-Semitism. But they typically also assert that the reasons for this particular failure lie in a deeper failure to understand the significance of nationalism and national identity along with other non-class-based commitments and identities. The argument here has been different. It is that the adaptation of too many Marxists to nationalism and the concession to the primacy of national identity is itself an important reason for this failure. What I also want to suggest in the concluding part of this article, that what is distinctive in Marx's own response to anti-Semitism and in his simultaneous response to nationalism provides the basis for an alternative approach which has been largely neglected. This alternative approach, moreover, was in fact taken up by some very important thinkers working on the margins of the Marxist tradition, or influenced by the cosmopolitan tradition within it, as they were forced to confront the Nazi radicalization of anti-Semitism. It was this very radicalization which forced them into a profound and essentially cosmopolitan rethinking of how anti-Semitism had developed and what was needed to respond to it. I refer in particular here to the rethinking undertaken in the 1940s by the leading figures of the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, as news of the extermination of the Jews began to reach them, even though their own work in every other respect was far more sophisticated and critical than anything produced at that time by other Marxists, especially those trapped within the dogmas of the Second and Third International. They had shared in the failure to take Nazi anti-Semitism seriously and give it any priority. Despite the fact that all the leading figures in the school were Jews themselves, they did not appear to think for a long time that this was of any relevance to their work as Marxists, or that Marxism need concern itself in any significant way with anti-Semitism. They were not, of course, alone in this. The universalist commitments which inspired many Jews to commit to the social democratic and perhaps even more so the communist movements left little space for thinking about dangers posed by anti-Semitism, even or perhaps especially to themselves. There was a widespread tendency to think that they would be targeted primarily or exclusively as leftists, not as Jews. This was not true, of course, for members of the Bund or Marxist Zionists who did place a much greater priority on fighting anti-Semitism, although in both cases they too were to be disappointed to a greater or lesser extent by the weakness of a cosmopolitan response from their respective non-Jewish comrades. Horkheimer had produced one of the school's few works on the question only in 1938, 5 years after the Nazis had come to power and 2 years after the Nuremberg laws had stripped Jews of their citizenship. In the course of what was in many respects a somewhat crude and reductionist analysis of the role of Jews in the economy, where they were assigned a central but now apparently doomed historical role as, quote, agents of circulation, end quote, Horkheimer claimed that Nazi anti-Semitism was only a temporary phenomenon, quote, at most, a safety valve for the younger members of the SA, end quote. This view was widely shared by his colleagues, and as late as 1942, Franz Neumann, who was the school's acknowledged expert on Nazism, insisted in Behemoth, his major work on the subject, that Nazi anti-Semitism was not important in its own right, but only the means to another end, a, quote, spearhead of terror, end quote, which could be used or discarded to fit the needs of the day. At the very moment the extermination camps were becoming fully operative, Neumann insisted that, quote, the Nazis will never allow a complete extermination of the Jews, end quote. To his considerable credit, Horkheimer then revised his own views and with Adorno rethought his entire approach to the question, an essential component of which was the adoption of a cosmopolitan perspective. It was not just that Horkheimer had come to realize, as he wrote to Marcuse, that, quote, the problem of anti-Semitism is much more complicated than I thought, end quote. It was that he now saw it as the, quote, focal point of injustice where the world shows its most horrible face, end quote. Quote, whoever accuses the Jews today aims straight at humanity itself. The Jews have become the martyrs of civilization. To protect the Jews has come to be a symbol of everything mankind stands for. The Jews have been made what the Nazis always pretended they were, the focal point of world history, end quote. Adorno emphatically agreed. Quote, anti-Semitism is today really the central injustice, and our form of physiognomy must attend to the world where it shows its face at its most gruesome, end quote. They had now come to think that, quote, just as it is true that one can only understand anti-Semitism by examining society, is becoming equally true that society itself can now only be understood through anti-Semitism. They now devoted considerable attention to the history of anti-Semitism, first laying out a wide-ranging research agenda for tracing anti-Semitism's genealogy going back to the First Crusades, and then going even deeper in their major work of this period, Dialectic of Enlightenment. The chapter on elements of anti-Semitism formed not only the last section of the work, but was, as Donna Vila has argued, the culmination of the overall argument. There is no space to go into this in any detail, but what does bear emphasizing here is the cosmopolitan vantage point that Adorno and Horkheimer adopted, that the history of anti-Semitism is intimately bound up with the history of humanity. That what was projected onto the Jews, they argued, could tell us a great deal not about Jews, but about tensions and contradictions inside society, about what could and could not be tolerated, about the nature and limits of civilization, and ultimately how an unprecedented form of barbarism became possible. Going further than Luxemburg, they now saw barbarism not simply as relapse, but something worse, something which changed the conditions of human existence. And, in this context, the prospects for socialism, at least for some time. A crucial aspect of this argument has to do with difference in particularity. The very problem that lay at the heart of constructions of the so-called, quote, Jewish question, end quote, what Adorno and Horkheimer argued connected all the elements was an anxiety and intolerance of that particularity that could take different forms at different times, sometimes religious, sometimes economic, sometimes social, but which were most effectively channeled and institutionally, quote, embodied, end quote, in a nationalist framework. What they also insisted on was the need for any conception of society to allow for difference within an overall conception of humanity itself. From that perspective, the particular identity of Jews was not a threat or a problem for society in the modern world, primarily the nation, but the opposite. It was not so much or only that they pointed to the contribution that Jews, and indeed Judaism, had made to the development of civilization, or that every form of anti-Semitism was fundamentally destructive, but they saw the particularity principle represented by Jews as a necessary and fundamental cosmopolitan principle. The attack on Jews was, at root, an attack on diversity. Back to and beyond Marx. This does not take us simply back to Marx, but to his starting point. Marx does not develop to any significant extent a cosmopolitan sense of the diversity of humanity, though he was repeatedly critical of efforts to flatten out difference, notably in his critique of the Gotha program. But he does reject any argument that singles out Jewish particularity as a problem. What Adorno and Horkheimer were doing was taking this rejection seriously and trying to think through its implications, both for the Jews and for humanity as a whole. They understood anti-Semitism in quite a rich and complex way as both an attack on a particular group and as an attack on humanity itself. A failure to respond to anti-Semitism was at the same time a failure to protect humanity, which would be irretrievably damaged by the annihilation of its Jewish element. The damage was already very great, of course. The Holocaust had destroyed a large percentage of Jews in the world, removed a Jewish presence from many nations who were now much more homogeneous than they had been before. It had proved possible to murder large numbers of people through the agency and apparatus of a modern nation-state. With the willing collaboration of many fellow citizens and the passive compliance of many more. What had been scarcely imagined as a possibility even by the most vehement anti-Semites had now become a reality. The Holocaust was a radical event in the history of both anti-Semitism and humanity which called for a radical response. Since Jews had not been protected within the nation-states across which they had been dispersed, new ways of thinking and new kinds of commitment were necessary, which were in Horkheimer and Adorno's minds essentially cosmopolitan, because, like Marx, they were grounded in a normative commitment to the human community. They were not alone, it has to be said, in coming to this conclusion at this critical time. Hannah Arendt, for all the differences she had with Horkheimer and especially Adorno, had been rethinking along similar lines. If she was not working within the Marxist tradition, she was arguably significantly influenced here by one Marxist in particular, Rosa Luxemburg. Like Luxemburg, Arendt had identified a major problem with nationalism, in particular the way in which minorities who were dispersed across nation-states were placed in acute danger by a conception of rights which confined them only to those deemed to be loyal and were the subjects of homogenizing nation-states. Jews were especially vulnerable in this context, attacked as unreliable as a source of corruption, and because they were supposedly purely self-interested of division and decomposition. The solution proposed by Arendt, and on the one hand, and Adorno and Horkheimer on the other, was, as Salah Ben Habib has also suggested, fundamentally cosmopolitan, but it was also new. In having to think more deeply about anti-Semitism, they rethought our understanding of humanity, of the universal as inherently diverse, as including particularity within it. This rethinking or development of cosmopolitanism was more than conceptual. It also carried with it a clear normative commitment to a solidarity across the boundaries of the nation-state with any group threatened with destruction in whole or in part. Or to make it more concrete, with genocide, the crime, after all, that the radicalized anti-Semitism of the Nazis had visited upon the Jews, a crime which by its very nature required a cosmopolitan response. Such a response was largely not forthcoming from one of the few sources from which it might have been mounted, the organized Marxist movement, which by then had largely, though not completely, turned its back on the cosmopolitan principles originally espoused by Marx, and on a connected understanding of anti-Semitism as a mortal threat both to Jews and to humanity itself. As that threat was realized in the Holocaust, there was some effort to retrieve and develop both these cosmopolitan principles in that understanding of anti-Semitism, albeit an effort that is by no means complete. To the extent to which anti-Semitism, even after the Holocaust, continues to pose a significant threat to Jews and to humanity itself, the history of how these principles and the understanding of how those principles and that understanding were both shaped and abandoned remains relevant, even if the organized Marxist movement may no longer provide the kind of central focus it might once have done. There are still resources which can be quarried from that history for those who seek to develop a more adequate cosmopolitan response to such a threat.